Hello everybody, my name's Rebecca Kurt. Obviously, I'm in my home today, so my setup's a little different, but we're going to be talking about the Cuban Revolution and how this was one people's struggle for independence and the overthrowing of colonialism. I hope you'll understand that there might be some little interruptions during this time, as my whole family is here and all my pets. My lovely fiance is filming the video for me, so to introduce the Cuban Revolution, this was a huge piece of history. I think we probably are all somewhat familiar with it, but we usually hear about it through the lens of American history, which really focuses on the Cuban Missile Crisis and the effects of the Soviet Union on Cuba, and I think there's a lot more to the story on the side of the Cuban people. I was really interested in this topic personally. Some of my best friends growing up were the grandchildren of Cuban refugees and told me about it from their perspective of growing up in the States with grandparents who were exiled from Cuba. So I thought this was really interesting and I wanted to learn more because I didn't have a good idea of how the Cuban Revolution really worked. So I think the main question is what happened? And a lot of us don't know these details, so I'm going to kind of cover this right now. So the U.S. took control of Cuba after the Spanish-American War, according to Encyclopedia Britannica. And then after the U.S. took control, they sort of took advantage of the sugar plantations and taking resources out of Cuba in a very colonist manner, even though we weren't directly colonizing them. So then there was a formation of the Cuban Republic, which was still very heavily U.S. controlled. So this eventually led to the regime of Batista, who was eventually disposed by Castro, and his supporters eventually killed by Castro as well. So the U.S. and Cuba obviously had a very weird little relationship, and the U.S. Basically controlled Batista's government. We supplied them with bullets and ammunition, and basically took the best resources out of Cuba, according to Swig. So racism and poverty in Cuba fueled Fidel Castro's takeover, which began with the July 26 movement, and this led through a series of guerrilla warfare to the rise of communism, according to Chomsky, which eventually ended up with Fidel Castro becoming dictator and sort of the sole leader of Cuba. So, this was originally a very peoples-driven revolution and changed the values of Cuba. So at the time, there was a lot of art in Cuba. I think still today, Cuba is really well known for its art. And according to Sardoy, there was this move to make all of the art for the revolution. Art was sort of channeled into becoming a mode for revolution. And there was a real movement, especially among artists, for education for all, especially the poor, oppressed Cubans at the time. There was also a rise, according to Hamilton, of socialist consciousness. The people started really thinking about how they wanted their government constructed and sort of came up with this very socialist idea of healthcare and food for all. And this was a really important staple of the Cuban Revolution. Another interesting facet of the revolution, according to Daniel, was the transformation of rumba, a Latin dance. This dance in Cuba was mostly practiced by Black Cubans and other lower class Cubans, and was always seen as a lower class tradition. This changed when the revolution started. It became a symbol of the revolution and sort of appropriated by the revolution to discuss race relations, which at the time were really bad. There was really systematic racism, which was actually fueled by the U.S. as well. So the rumba became kind of this example of what it meant to be a revolutionary in Castro's revolution. So this all sounds kind of great right now, but I think in this class we now understand that war is not without its casualties, and war is always messy and always ugly eventually. So I took this personal testimony of what the war was like from a book by Malouf, and it was a book highlighting Cuban women's voices within the revolution. And so this woman says, "By the time I was 18, Jose had died in combat. The military had searched our home twice, and they took the only pair of shoes I owned. This is the story about how I got involved in the revolution." So, as you can see from this quote, this woman lost her boyfriend. People came into her home. Batista soldiers came into her home and took things from her. This was a very abusive government. And also, sorry for the interruption there, my video cut out. So we were discussing this quote from Malouf's book, highlighting the voices of Cuban revolutionary women, and what this said about what was happening at the time of the war. Another case I want to highlight is that of Uber Matos, who was a moderate in Castro's guerrilla forces, and actually helped Castro achieve the place he eventually did. When he saw Castro was headed towards being a dictator and full-on communism, he tried to resign and back away from the cause. And in this case, Castro imprisoned him for 27 years before he was eventually exiled to Florida. And this is according to PBS. So we can see that the government gets more restrictive on people's voices and takes away people's rights to express themselves in this government. I think another important thing to highlight is the deaths of Castro's own men. Gil writes about the Oriente Province landing, which is a big landing of 80 of Castro's guerrilla forces on a beach. Only about 12 of them are said to have escaped. The rest were slaughtered by Batista's forces. So that's a lot of young, healthy people that died right there. And the foreign notes, a lot of great things came out of the revolution for lower class and Black Cubans in some ways, such as education and less poverty. Freedom of speech was also taken from everyone. So there were certain, what we consider democratic human rights that were taken from people. And finally, PBS highlights the 2 million Cubans who were exiled, most of whom came to the States. 2 million people is such a vast quantity of people to push out of one's country, and I imagine that was a big loss in some ways for the country of Cuba, even if some of them were oppressive. So I think the best way to understand the Cuban Revolution is through the lens of Fanon. Fanon writes a lot about attacking and pushing out the oppressor, about pushing out the colonists, because colonialism, in Fanon's view, is this force that debilitates culture. And Fanon also writes some about the way that colonized people wish to be in the place of the colonist. And I think this makes a lot of sense in Castro's revolution. When he pushes out the colonists, Castro himself becomes an oppressor, sort of this sub-oppressor underneath what used to be the oppressive U.S. regime. So Castro sort of lives into this violence, as Chris Hedges would suggest, violence catches like fire, and this is what Castro sort of becomes. But I think in the explanation of what happened in the Cuban Revolution, why people were so emphatic about getting the colonists out of their country, it's important to understand everything Fanon says about the way that colonialism takes away from religion and the arts of the people, and the people's feeling of self-worth. And not only that, materially oppresses people and keeps them in poverty. I would like to contrast this really quickly with some nonviolent theorists such as Dr. King and Thoreau. Dr. King led, or in a way, a really similar movement, similar focused on some socialist values, a similar focus on poverty, a similar focus on Black people's rights. But Dr. King's, in a way, was much more successful, did not end up with a dictatorship, and made progressive change. And I think we see sort of maybe a shortcoming in violence in the Cuban Revolution, and sort of the beauty of this nonviolent movement. I'd also like to contrast this with Thoreau's vision of nonviolent movement. Thoreau believed in a highly individualized nonviolence, and this was a very collective act, as was Dr. King's movement. So this is sort of a very stark and direct contrast to this sort of individualized idea of nonviolence, but rather a collective movement, which, as we can see in history, collective movements have way more weight than in individualized nonviolence. So, to summarize and conclude, Batista's reign was indeed oppressive. It kept Black Cubans in their place. According to the U.S. government, it allowed the U.S. to exploit Cuba. It kept lower class Cubans from getting an education. I think in our normal education, we miss the part that Batista's reign was truly horrible. Many people died throughout this revolution, both because of Castro and Batista, and Castro eventually did become a dictator, which sort of undermined everything he said he was working for. So I think there are a lot of parallels to Fanon's work. In the end, it did not end up the way Fanon envisioned a violent revolution ending. So I think there are a lot of parallels, but the end result was not what Fanon hoped it would be. So I have a few questions for the class. How effective do you feel the Cuban Revolution really was at achieving its goals? How do you feel the revolution would have been better conducted so as not to end in a dictatorship? Would nonviolence have been effective in this example? Thinking about Dr. King's movement, kind of contrast it to what happened in Castro's movement. I hope you learned something, and I hope everyone's staying safe and well. And I'm sorry that this was a bit of a chaotic environment, but I really do think this revolution is an important thing we should learn more about and understand more about what drives people to these violent acts, such as Castro's. And I hope this did something to de-vilify Castro in a way, and help you understand what Batista did to get him to that place. But also, I hope you come away with...
But hopefully you also have an understanding of why Castro shouldn't be glorified and some of the harm he caused to people. So I want to show you my sources now. Hopefully you can see these, and if you're ever interested, you can look them up. Right, yeah, there you go. I hope everyone has a super nice day.